All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. We're at the home stretch, almost there to the end here. So yes, my name is Jimmy Bogard. I guess there's still Twitter, so yeah, you can find me on Twitter, X, formerly known whatever, at @jbogard. The code behind this presentation you can find on my GitHub at github.com/jbogard. There's a presentations repository, and so any presentation I give, all the sample code is up there. I usually push to the repository like once a year or so if it's out of date, just ping me and I'll push everything up again. And then I blogged about this topic on my blog and my website at jimmybogard.com. And so my day job is an independent consultant. And so I help teams modernize their systems, whether it's adding domain-driven design, or they're doing event-driven architecture, or in this case, I had a team that was wanting to migrate from a .NET 4 point something application to a .NET, well, at the time it was .NET 6, but they've got so many applications that today the system actually, my stand-up is like an hour and a half, is to migrate their apps to .NET 8. Now, when we were first starting this project, I had tried to do this kind of activity a couple times, and it was really, really hard. And it kind of felt like the folks at Microsoft were like focusing way too much on like the new shiny stuff without providing any kind of guidance or direction or tooling of how do I get from an existing application that is .NET 4.8 to .NET, .NET Core, the new good stuff. And what I did know is that in any kind of these kinds of architecture evolutions, where we're taking an existing system and migrating to something else, what I never want to do is have an approach or strategy that is, let's just build this completely new system to the side for 6, 9, 12 months, whatever it is, and then just flip the switch and kind of cross our fingers and hope and pray that everything works. But of course, hope is not a strategy. Ideally, I would have something that would allow us to gradually migrate from one of these systems to the other. And I kind of think of this in my head. I'm from Texas, so you might hear a y'all every now and again. And so what we do a lot is this, which is highway construction, which is not a great solution for transportation problems, but it's what we do. And so I see this all the time. This we have existing highways, and we're constantly like changing them and adding to them, whatever. So what never happens in these kinds of large-scale construction projects is they don't build an entirely new highway to the side, and then one day, sometime in the future, we just like swap over traffic from the old thing to the new thing. Instead, what we see is a much more incremental approach where we are building little parts of the system, and then the kind of the new way of doing things, or the new construction, and then over time we have traffic that kind of will be diverted to the new highway. But it's never like we completely shut off traffic and then just one day flip the switch and everything's good to go. So ideally, I can have the same kind of approach as well, that it is not a flip the switch and just hope things work, but instead is more of an incremental strategy. Now, one of the earliest challenges I had was just to try to convince the business that this is a good thing to do. Because Microsoft also did that awesome thing where they changed the name of things, where they had .NET 4.5, actually, I got a picture of this. These are the Microsoft releases, and it's very small, which is fine because there's so many things that are released over time. So I'm going to kind of zoom into kind of the more recent picture here. And this is some online diagramming tool where they actually ran out of nodes they could put in this graph. So that's why it stops at .NET 7. They ran out in the free version, and so I couldn't put any more things on here. So somewhere past over here in 2024 or into 2023 was the release of .NET 8, and of course this year they'll release .NET 9 as well. And so in the light green on the bottom here, there's this .NET Framework set of releases. So that's the Windows .NET Framework, Windows-only .NET Framework. And you'll notice that around 2019, those light green little bubbles stop. So the last release of .NET 4.8 was .NET, full .NET Framework was .NET 4.8. I think that 4.8.1 was the security release as well. Initially, Microsoft said, right, the new hotness is .NET Core, so everyone should go to that, and we're no longer going to support .NET Framework, full .NET Framework, whatever. Naturally, people revolted. There's a lot of existing systems out there that are still using full .NET Framework. And so those systems still need to be supported, so Microsoft did relent. So don't worry, you don't have to do any of the things I'm talking about today. You can stay on .NET 4.8, basically until the heat death of the universe, I guess. And it'll continue to be supported. The problem is there's a difference between just kind of support from a product perspective versus like actually improving that framework over time. And so the story is that the .NET framework will still get security updates, like yay, security updates, but no other improvements are going to be put into that framework. Complicating the story is that they changed the name of the new .NET from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5, which was very confusing for someone saying, oh, we're on .NET 4. That should be really simple to upgrade to .NET 5, right? No, it is not simple to upgrade from one of these to the next. But luckily, in the .NET 6 release timeframe, Microsoft did release some tooling to make this migration process quite a bit easier for specific kinds of applications. So in this application, the clients wanted to migrate from their .NET 4.8 application to, at the time, .NET 6, and then today they're going to .NET 8. So the very first thing I wanted to do as someone coming in and, well, I had to answer the question, how much is this going to cost? I wanted to understand kind of the scope and breadth of the existing system that we were wanting to migrate. So my first thing I was doing was just looking at, well, what the heck is this application actually doing? Now, funnily enough, this was actually a system that I helped build like in 2010. So I won't be talking about my coding practices from back then. If you want to hear about that, you'll have to buy me a beer after this, and there will be no recording devices about my actual opinions. But I just wanted to understand from just kind of technology perspective and how big is this thing, what the heck is going on here. So in this application, it was mainly a web app. That's like mainly most of the stuff that it was doing. So it had ASP.NET MVC HTTP endpoints. So these are the things that responded to HTTP requests. And this included MVC, like traditional server-side rendering junk, as well as APIs. So there were some pages they converted to like some early version of React, and so it was like they were trying to move towards modern web, and then realized, oh, this was really hard to do in this framework back then, so they kind of stopped there. So it had both server-side MVC as well as API controllers and actions. There were also non-MVC HTTP endpoints. So these are the old crusty stuff that I really had tried to forget about and just block out of my memory altogether. But things like ASPX, web forms, ASHX, and if you tell me that like component-oriented programming is web forms all over again, you're wrong. I can tell you why later. But no, there were still these kinds of things around. There was ASP.NET MVC middleware, so they're plugging into the request pipeline in the MVC world. But there's also just the ASP.NET middleware, so we had multiple different kinds of middleware going on. The MVC middleware was all kind of .NET C# based. Whereas the ASP.NET middleware, that's all that stuff in the web config that again, I had hoped to forget about, but like, oh gosh, that's right, there's all this junk in there as well. We also had, dependencies on external libraries. So our application was a like in-tier, web application talking to a database, and so we were going to have library dependencies that we used to help do that as well. Some of those dependencies were upgradable, and some were not, and these are the things we had to figure out. We also had component dependencies. So we had grid components, file upload components. Like they had purchased, I think, DevExpress or something like that. A third-party component library to make their web app look nice and neat and polished. So looking at this application, I realized like there's a lot going on here, and we weren't trying to improve things as we went. We more or less wanted a like-for-like end result, so that the end user would not notice or tell that something had been migrated from the .NET 4.8 app to the new .NET 6.7.8 app. So we weren't trying to, like, quote, improve the architecture and any of these things here. We were just trying to migrate the code, migrate the application without touching anything else, because this application was so big that it would have been impossible for us to try to improve things as we went. So in order to get an understanding of what was in this application, one of the things we did was just some stupid reflection code that said, okay, just go look at the directory structure, go look at the type metadata, and just like spit out, here are all the HTTP endpoints. because there isn't really anything built into ASP.NET's, the old version, that can tell you, like, here are all the endpoints in your application. You actually have to like kind of reverse engineer, well, what are all the controllers, the actions, the APIs, the SPX pages? You have to have you have to kind of go figure that out for yourself. So we just wrote a bit of code that eventually, and this is for a sample application, would spit out, here's all the controllers, and then here's some more other like interesting information about each of those controllers. So as we went down the migration process, we were also trying to figure out, were there dependencies between different pages in the application? Were there certain pages that use some technology that we would have to have some kind of spike or figure out how to migrate the specific piece of technology? So we were, as part of the just kind of spitting everything out, we were also looking at the sort of characteristics of like, well, is this one using any kind of filters? Is this one using any kind of exotic technologies that would affect how easy it is for us to migrate one of these controllers and actions over? But eventually, we did need to get to like actual Jira tickets to say, a developer is going to start a set of work. And so this also, just spitting out all the different pages, our migration strategy was to try to migrate one page or one controller at a time. So each developer would get a page or a controller. They would migrate that. Then that would be a pull request that would then get integrated and ideally pushed out all the way to production before we moved on to the next one. That was another kind of critical thing we looked at was, again, we don't want big bang migrations. As much as possible, we want to migrate on the smallest incremental step we could manage. And so that really for us was not the individual HTTP endpoints, like the controller action, but really the entire controller all at once. The next thing we looked at was, okay, these are all the pages in the application. Well, what other things are in the application that are used to support the function of the system? And so the first thing we looked at was all of the MVC features that were turned on and all of the middleware associated with ASP.NET Core, or I'm sorry, ASP.NET MVC5. So in here, this is like the application start. Again, I forgot this global ASAX thing exists. And so we can see, yeah, this is like kind of the stock-looking thing of ASP.NET MVC5, where, okay, we've got one line here that says register global filters, and those global filters are the middleware written in C# for everything in our system. There's other stuff as well that we will have to migrate. So some of these things we have to kind of figure out what is the translation of this specific feature in the new world of ASP.NET Core. And sometimes that new feature existed, and sometimes it didn't. And I'll get into the kind of the sad ones that didn't exist here in a bit. One of the other things we were looking at as well is some of these pieces we could make the decision, should we migrate this thing or not? Is this custom piece of code that we were writing as part of the ASP.NET MVC5 application, is that now a, quote, solved problem in ASP.NET Core land? Because there are definitely some cases we hit where, hey, this feature that a lot of us had to write custom code for out of, like, I don't know, like, not my book, I hope. I did write a book on MVC, but I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. These are like kind of code snippets that people had kind of built over the years of like, well, MVC can't handle this specific scenario, so here's a bit of custom code and a filter you can drop in to make it do this kind of stuff. But sometimes we didn't need to pull those things over. And so a lot of these things were then decision points of, hey, is there like a built-in way of doing this now that we don't have to rely on custom code? So there still was a little bit of decision making along the way to see, is this code something we actually want to bring over or not? Another thing that I had completely blocked out of my head was Owen. Do you remember that? Yes. Open Web Interface for .NET? Yes? No? I don't know. Whatever. It's gone now, kind of. So this stuff was an open source middleware implementation that looks very, very similar to ASP.NET Core as you see it today. And I wonder where the ASP.NET Core team got this idea. I don't know. So this set of middleware is just another set of middleware we had to go through to understand, should we bring this stuff forward over or not? Some things only exist in ASP.NET MVC middleware, but something like SignalR that we see here and Hangfire, those are two technologies that are built on top of Owen. And so we definitely saw those like, oh, we definitely want SignalR going forward. And Hangfire is another kind of middleware thing piece as well. And then finally, I had to go crack open that web.config file and be like, what the heck is going on inside of here? My sample app doesn't have a whole lot, but yours may have quite a bit. And luckily, like the IDEs are pretty good about telling you things that are being used or not. But there's going to be some stuff in there you're like, oh, this is going to be so simple. You crack open the web.config and like, well, there goes that simplicity. There's going to be something in there. There's going to be a gremlin or something in there that may throw a giant wrench into the engine here. So it's something we have to go through kind of step by step. And a lot of this will just be translated into the program CS, like middleware in C# land and ASP.NET Core. And some of it just may not have an analog at all, and we have to just abandon it. It really depends. I have to go through this XML, lovely XML, line by line to understand what everything is going on inside of here. Oh gosh, of course we have dependencies as well. This is another sort of frustrating thing, is that there's not really a good tool out there. And if there is, please tell me afterwards. There's not a good tool to look at your list of dependencies and say, what is the compatibility or path for us to get from the versions being referenced here to .NET 6, 7, 8. There's no guarantee that any package here, one, is even supported in .NET 6, 7, 8 land. That was one of the big risks that my clients were trying to get away from, is that they had hit walls in a lot of their dependencies. They said these dependencies are no longer being updated for the full .NET framework. They're still being supported and updated for .NET Core land, but they are not, the authors of those libraries, and I'm one of them, is no longer supporting the full .NET framework. So we have to look at this list and say, well, what is the kind of path to get over to support for ASP.NET Core? Is it as simple as upgrading the version and saying I got to go from here to here, or is it something else completely here? So when the client first asked us to investigate the feasibility of us doing this migration, this is one of those sort of, like, luckily, as fate would have it, Microsoft released a new technology in order to assist people to migrate from the full .NET Framework applications over to .NET 6 at the time. And these tools have been updated since then to provide more and more features to help you to get from the full .NET Framework over to ASP.NET Core. And the big technology here is through this thing called the system.web adapters. Now, back in the day, before this, the way that we would migrate our applications from full framework to, at the time it was like .NET Core 2.1 or 3.1, was to put a reverse proxy in front of the applications so that a request would come in and our reverse proxy configuration would say, hey, is it in this special list of paths that we've already migrated? Then go to this other, the new application. Otherwise, fall back to the existing application. So what this did was get rid of that and said, instead of you having to put in Nginx or whatever, we're going to be using YARP, which is yet another reverse proxy, to do exactly that. But we're going to be doing it in a very special way. So the application starts off like this, right? This is our existing application where we've got incoming requests hitting a .NET Framework application and then going to business logic. And by the way, I'm focusing solely on ASP.NET applications because that's what I did. Like, all my talks are about experiences on actual projects. So if you've got a WinForms client or whatever, I have no idea. Like, do what I did, Google, figure it out. But the overall approach of trying to make things incremental and do small steps, that is what I would always try to do. So yeah, this one was an existing .NET Framework application, incoming requests, hitting the framework application, talking to business logic, and then, of course, talking to a database as well. So the very first step is to introduce an ASP.NET Core application. This is going to be the new target of all of our migrated features, this ASP.NET Core application. But it also hosts YARP. So the application is running the business logic and all that stuff, but also hosting YARP. So if a request comes into this application and it can't handle that request, then it will automatically forward that request over to the backend framework application. So our very first step was actually, I'm deploying an ASP.NET Core application with just this reverse proxy and nothing else. Like zero anything else. because that was also going to force us to do a bunch of other stuff. But the idea is that, okay, let's introduce this new application into this entire ecosystem. And the nice thing about this YARP proxy that's redundant is that I don't have to have something else. I don't have to have Nginx or some other reverse proxy put in front of all of our systems. Instead, the ASP.NET Core application with this self-hosted reverse proxy will just seamlessly handle these requests. That if one's here, call this code. If it's not here, then just forward it on through to the framework application. Now in this picture, there are more arrows than this picture, right? That's one arrow. That's two arrows. Twice as many arrows. That also means that there is going to be additional latency to these requests. There is a performance penalty for this extra reverse proxy thing in the middle. So you may have to do some testing to see like what's the what's the impact to your system. For our applications and clients, it was absolutely negligible. Like these are applications talking to a database. So like an extra 10 nanoseconds or 100 nanoseconds for this reverse proxy was nothing. It was a drop in the bucket of everything else that was going on in the system. But depending on your application, that may be more or less critical for you. So definitely test this out in a production-like environment to see if that's OK for you. But for any system I've ever worked on, I don't know what that says about me. This is OK. Now, there are going to be cases where we have things that will live in the framework application that we want to take advantage of or use in the ASP.NET Core application. So consider something like session state. Session state is shared state that lives in the framework application, but the session systems of ASP.NET Core and .NET Framework, ASP.NET 4.5 or whatever, are incompatible, like grossly incompatible. They're not the same at all. The most you can do is like, maybe you can share the data protection certificate for the cookies or something, but that's about it. You cannot share session between these two systems. So the adapter part, for a lot of things that you need to have like kind of some shared understanding or knowledge or state between the framework application and the .NET 6 and 7.8 application, that's the adapter part. The adapters will allow us to, depending on what technology we're trying to take advantage of, seamlessly integrate between the framework application and the ASP.NET Core application. And I'm going to go through these in detail, the ones that we hit at least. That was kind of the second piece. It was just not a proxy, but also these adapters that allow us to have these two applications still have, for the things that need to share, they can still share those different components. So the idea is we will migrate controllers, actions, and views, whatever, or pages, whatever, from the framework application over to the core application. So eventually, like it flips. Like now I have way more code in the ASP.NET Core application and way less code in the .NET Framework application. So at some point, the ASP.NET Core application is handling all of your requests and is not forwarding anything over to the framework application. And at that point is like the greatest feeling of like delete. Delete the framework application, get rid of it, and now you're completely migrated over. All right, so I'm going to show a demo of this upgrade assistant from Microsoft. Let's see. Can I stop this? And can I make sure I am here? OK, great. All right. I've bumped up the font. Is that big enough for the folks in the back? Yes? OK. So this is just file new ASP.NET MVC application. So it's MVC 5, but just like hello world, whatever. And let's make sure it actually, still runs. So it doesn't have all the dependencies. Like it's not talking to a database. What I just really wanted to show is the upgrade process from ASP.NET MVC 5 to ASP.NET Core 8 is where it is now. OK, so this is, the old crusty-looking file new project from ASP.NET 4.5. But still, ASP.NET is a free web framework for building great websites using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all three. OK. So What I can do here is I first have installed an extension. Installed. This is the .NET Upgrade Assistant. You do not have to do this. I will show you the code of what this is doing, but it's just kind of a nice first step. And so this is something to help just first process of creating the ASP.NET Core application that is going to be the upgraded version of this. All right. So I will right-click this and select Upgrade. It's going to ask me if I want to upgrade the project to a newer .NET version. Yes, I do. And then you'll have only one upgrade type. There used to be another one, which was like do it all at once. And then you're faced with like 10,000 compile errors, which I love, right? Like, let's get cracking on all these 10,000 compile errors. So no, they got rid of that. Like, it didn't work. There was an older upgrade assistant that tried to automatically migrate, and like I've never seen any of those things work for any technology in my career ever. So that's not this. This is the side-by-side incremental project upgrade. Next. We're going to create a new project as opposed to targeting an existing project. And the name is going to be called CPH DevFest Migration Example Core, because I like to be specific. And the project template, you could pick MVC or Web API. But really, that's picking the file new ASP.NET Core template. That's just like different NuGet packages and different like stuff in your program CS. So I'm going to leave it with the default here of MVC. OK, now we get to pick the target framework. The title of this talk was .NET 8 migration, so let's pick that. It's .NET 8. I will not be picking .NET 9, yet to have a client that is OK with wanting to use a preview version of .NET. So next, and finish. It's going to go through this junk of doing the migration stuff. It's going to create a new project. Actually, it should be done already. Oh, there it goes. OK. So now there's a new project down here, the CPH DevFest Migration Example Core, but it's not that exciting or like magical. It's just a MVC SDK, a web SDK project with the normal junk you put in here. Of course, you'd want to put the other package references too. But it's got two packages it's going to reference. One is a system web adapters. So this is the thing that's going to translate between different server features of ASP.NET 4.5 and ASP.NET Core. And YARP, our reverse proxy here. In terms of the actual program CS here, you notice there's like no other controllers or anything else here. It's just program CS, nothing else exciting going on here. In the actual kind of setup logic here, we are what's different than kind of your normal application. It's adding the service registration for system web adapters and the HTTP forwarder. So the HTTP forwarder is YARP. And then down here, I will have use system web adapters. Critical that that is the last thing in the list, right? We want the last thing that happens in the application execution pipeline is to map the forwarding over our use system web adapters, so it's the very last thing that happens in the list of things that happens in a web application. And so right here, this is the last middleware we register. And then finally, for mapping the requests, we will first map the default controller route. So that's controller action view stuff. And then after that, we'll map this forwarder. So if this one cannot handle the request, then we have a catch-all forwarder that will map all those requests to, it's so ugly with all these lambdas and junk. It'll map this request to what I've configured as the proxy2 address. So you will have two different applications running with two different ports. And now I'm going to be configuring the .NET Core application to forward over to the new port for the existing framework application. And then finally, there's like a thing that says, make sure it's the last one in the list. So the max value, the endpoint, because this also works with any kind of ASP.NET Core stuff. So if you want to use minimal APIs, I don't know what other exotic things you might have going on, this works with all those things because it's just middleware in the ASP.NET Core pipeline. OK, so now let's run this and see what happens. So I'm going to hit F5. And one of the things we're going to see here is that I'm no longer running one application, the .NET Framework application. I need to run both of them now because the .NET Framework application still needs to handle requests, but the kind of main thing that's handling requests is going to be the ASP.NET Core 8 application. So that port is different. It's 7029, but you'll notice that it looks exactly the same, right? This is ASP.NET Core, and then if I look here, we can see that, hey, we were getting all this requests for stuff, and we forwarded all these requests over, proxying over to the existing ASP.NET 4.8 application. In fact, if you want to see it, if I just pop open one of these requests, sure, the fab icon, control click, and if I get rid of this, okay, so same application, right? This is the ASP.NET Core application, transparently proxying my request to the ASP.NET 4.8 application. When I first saw this, I was like, there's no way this works, right? There's no way it's this easy to do this kind of proxying where it's just a few lines of code in an ASP.NET Core application and it just, quote, works. Because I remember those days of hand mucking with Nginx config files for, oh, in this sprint, we migrated these controllers. So someone go edit the Nginx config file and add those paths in there. It's like, no, we got you. We got you, fam. It'll all just be, as we migrate things over, they'll just, well, not magically, they'll just be served by the ASP.NET Core application. Okay, so that was like the first sort of initial thing we did was, what's the kind of base technology we're going to be using for this migration process? And hey, this thing worked, so huzzah. Okay, so our very first kind of story, after we went through a bit of like discovery and prototyping and spiking, was simply just to have an empty proxy that did nothing except proxy every single request over to the .NET Framework application. So it was very empty. It was like just nothing in there, and then the application would just kind of seamlessly serve request over from the underlying framework application. But, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, right? Because we want to have this very small first step deployed all the way out to production. I want to make sure that all my build and deploy pipelines can handle .NET 8. And, like, they probably can't today, because you're probably targeting .NET 4.8, not .NET 8. And so as part of this process, we're like, oh, right, now we got to build this additional application. We got to package it up. We got to make sure our deployed environments, and I won't talk much about those. This existing client was also going through a migration from on-prem to Azure. So we actually had to target both IIS and Azure App Services. So that's a whole other mess we had to worry about. But the critical thing was we wanted to do like the smallest thing possible to be able to get a full build and deploy pipeline up and running and working. Okay, so the next step was like, okay, let's migrate our first controller. Oh my God, that's going to be a lot of stuff. So we had to make sure that there are going to be cases where there's shared code between the existing MVC5 application and the .NET Core 8 application. So we got to make a shared library to be able to do all this. Now, a lot of you probably already have this, right? You've got like, maybe you're using clean architecture or whatever that's got a shared project with your business logic and entities and junk. So you might already have this, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that that is all ready to run a .NET 8. So the things that we were putting in there is basically, okay, go find the guts of your controller actions. And this was using a very early version of my Mediator project. And so we were like, we'll just ignore all the ASP.NET MVC5 junk. And really, I just want like the business logic behind there is the things that need to be shared between or referenceable between both the ASP.NET 4.8 and MVC, too many versions here, .NET 8 and .NET 4.5. So this will be like all of our data models, right? EF Core or EF6. That was one other thing we found was that this existing system was using EF6. And we thought, oh no, we're going to have to migrate all those to EF Core, which is a whole thing. But no, the EF team said, right, this is a huge blocker for teams migrating to .NET Core. So how about we, throw people a bone and say, okay, we'll go ahead and multi-target EF6 to both .NET modern, .NET 6.7.8, as well as .NET 4.5, whatever. So luckily, we didn't have to like migrate everything to EF Core or something else. This would also be all of our business logic, so any kind of common logic that things were calling into each other. But it was really any non-UI code. UI code is not compatible between those different versions. If you've got a lot of like custom UI templates, helpers, components, if that's all like ASP.NET 4.5 stuff, you can't use it in ASP.NET Core. The namespaces are all different. Like the pipelines, it's all different. So those you do have to kind of just rewrite or like re-implement in ASP.NET Core land. Now, in terms of what this project targets, this may not be familiar to a lot of developers, but there is this idea that you can target this kind of common interface implementation of .NET Standard 2.0. And when you compile a library for .NET Standard 2.0, it will use the correct target runtime when that code runs in the final actual runnable framework. So .NET Standard 2.0 code, when running in .NET 4.8, does not run .NET Standard 2.0. It actually runs .NET 4.8. And so that's kind of the least common target framework for .NET 4.8 and .NET 8. But we hit cases where there was code or dependencies that were not able to be shared between, did not support both of those frameworks. And so you can actually make that project target multiple target frameworks. And we did this as well. So we'd say, if you're on .NET 4.8, use this version of the NuGet packages. If you're on .NET 8, use this version of the .NET packages, because that was the only way we can get a single code base to handle multiple things. That can get super complicated with, if you're using APIs that aren't compatible with .NET 8, you may have to do some shims or it's kind of workarounds to be able to get this to work. Luckily, we had very few of those, and this was relatively straightforward. We wound up having to upgrade a lot of our packages from the current version they were today to a version that did support .NET 8 and the full .NET framework. And for most of these things, that made a lot of sense. Some things were very specific to the ASP.NET Core or ASP.NET 4.5 runtime. So you see down here, there's one of them that's fluent validation.mvc5. Well, that's not going to have an analog in ASP.NET Core. I'm not going to reference MVC5 package from ASP.NET Core. So we just use like, well, what is the correct thing to use for that specific dependency, and reference that one in the appropriate version. So our final version was this core application that shared like DB context, DB entities, a lot of as much business logic as we could possibly share. And then now I can actually do that first controller that is something calling into business logic. Now I'm not copying and pasting a lot of code. It's all leveraging the shared code. So the next thing we were looking at is, OK, now we can finally pick a controller to migrate. And one of the first things we saw is that the first controller is really hard to migrate, because you think about all the other stuff that's being used in a page, like there's all the CSS and JavaScript and all those kind of shared components, layout templates, blah, blah, blah. It could be pretty big a first lift just to get just to show a piece of text on the page. And so I kind of liken it to climbing Mount Everest. There's you don't want to try to summit, be the first person to summit in one day. You want to pick something that's more manageable, and you're not one of those poor people that are left on the side of the mountain forever. So we said, okay, we want to pick something that is not the most difficult thing to migrate. That hopefully there's something that is doing something very simple and will force us to not spend a lot of time on the business logic stuff, but we know there's going to be a lot of time spent on all the UI stuff. So we're going to try to use Microsoft's tooling to do so, and we'll experience the meh together. Now, a good first controller to migrate, I'm looking at things like, are there any pages in our system that don't require authentication? Because that is a whole thing that I'll be talking about here in a minute. Is there a contact us or FAQ or about us, right? That's just static content not doing anything. Then that's a good example for us to be the first one we migrate, because then it doesn't have to bring a bunch of other junk along with it. All right, so let's go back to our solution. And then over here, I can right-click this controller and say upgrade controller. This is like, you're so hopeful this is going to be great. Won't this be great? I could just go right-click controller, F5, run. Okay, great. Next one, commit, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, oh, that was quick. Sure. Yeah, upgrade selection. So it's like, oh, I got this stuff. I got these pages, whatever. These are the views that are coming over, and it is complete. Okay. Something cool here is the Endpoints Explorer. So this tells you all the existing endpoints in your application on the left and the things that have been migrated on the right. So it is like smart enough to know that here's all the junk you got going on today. Mostly, like it was pretty good. And here's what it's going to be migrated to on the right. Okay, so we've got a controller. Here's our home controller. Okay, so this is ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET 4.5, Core 4.5, Core 4.5. Anyone play the game Spot the Difference? It's just this, right? The using statement, right? That's like, oh, using System Web MVC, now it's much better. Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC. This is a very dumb controller, right? Yours are probably doing a lot more stuff, so there are things that are going to be a little bit different. So mostly what I'm doing when I'm migrating controllers is fixing namespaces and type names. But there's a very kind of well-known finite list of those things, like, oh, before there was no such thing as I action result or I action result of T. So some of those things just have a slight naming change to get them from one to the other. All right, so let's run this. And it's going to be great. Uh-oh. This looks like a web app that I would build, which is devoid of CSS altogether. Okay, well, what happened here? Is the existing application still working okay? Let me go find, what was it? 44 something other, right? What was it? If I go to my app settings here, I can actually see the proxy to, oh gosh, it's actually over here in launch settings. That is, here's the proxy to is this. So let's go check this one out and see if I didn't accidentally break the existing application somehow, which is been known to happen. Okay, this is the 4.5 or 4.8 app. Okay, so that looks good. This looks less good. What's going on here? Why is it missing all the CSS, JavaScript, all that stuff? This is our first, very sad, depressing realization because we thought, we're going to knock this out in no time flat. And then we hit F5, this may take a little longer. So this looks good, right? This looks almost exactly the same. So we got, the view starts. Okay, whatever, just layout, imports, whatever, tag helpers. We're not using those yet. Layout, how about this? Oh, that's why it's helpfully commented out the part that is pulling in the CSS and JavaScript bundling. Everything else will get migrated over. So we'll do things like fixing namespaces. Sometimes the things won't migrate exactly. There will be some compile errors, but those are relatively straightforward. But this is a big miss, or something that's really a big hole in our approach here, is that it's not bringing over any of the bundling and minification. So that's the meh part. It would have been so great for it to be able to migrate that part over, but it could not. So that first controller, just the controller part, is going to force us to bring over all of the dependencies that are part of that constructor argument. So we had to pull over all of the DI configuration as well. This is one of those places that I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot how terrible it was in MVC 5, or really all of the old MVCs, where they had to bolt on dependency injection to the ASP.NET framework, which did not support dependency injection. Everything was static properties and static methods and stuff. So DI is kind of there in ASP.NET Classic, but will likely require a manual migration. It's also not really worth trying to share any of this code. So when we brought over a new controller, we would see what were the dependencies this thing was using, how are those dependencies getting registered, and then manually pull over that registration in the way that it made sense in our new world. We also saw that the kind of, quote, stock container from Microsoft may not be possible to use. Depending on how much you're using in your existing DI container, Microsoft's DI container tries to take a least common denominator approach, except for things that they really need in ASP.NET Core. Then they'll just bolt stuff on that they need. So you may or may not be able to just say, well, let's not depend on ninject, because it hasn't been released in 8 years anyway. Let's use stock container. We couldn't do that. There was enough things that we were doing custom that we didn't want to redesign or rip out. So we just wound up like upgrading the container and then manually moving over registration when it made sense. So we went from, in this case, we went from something called structure map to the ASP.NET Core version of this, which is called Lamar. So if you're using something like autofac, that may be fairly straightforward for you to copy that over, but I would not try to share the configuration because there's so much difference in the dependency injection supports in ASP.NET 4.5 that it's not worth trying to do. The views, yes. So this is our first major problem, is that ASP.NET MVC 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever, supported bundling and minification as a core feature of the framework. So we went here and saw, oh, right, this is where we're pulling in the jQuery thing and doing the bundling stuff for our CSS as well. But bundling is not a feature in ASP.NET Core. And as far as I can tell, will never be a feature. So what do we do? Like, this is we need this feature. We don't want to go back to the dark days. And we also didn't necessarily want to re-implement everything. So we looked at our options here. So the first option, and this is, you can just go to Microsoft's website. They have this description there as well. For bundling and minification, there is an OSS library called Web Optimizer, and it is built by someone from the ASP.NET Core team, but it's a third-party package, right? It's a separate add-on to ASP.NET Core, and is very similar to the bundling and minification of MVC5, but not exactly. So you can't copy and paste the code and expect it to work. It will not. They're like just enough differences where even like the URLs are different. So I can't even use the bundled sources. I'll have a picture here in a second. Or we say, okay, let's not do this like server-side bundling. Let's do what all the cool JavaScript kids do, which is use an external tool to do so. I don't even know. Webpack, is that still a thing? I don't know if they've gone to like camel.js or some other noun.js thing. But to say, okay, let's not use this server-side OSS library. Let's use something that is like the industry standard. But that would require actually a pretty big re-architecting of our front-end assets. The existing front-end assets were not designed for this external node kind of bundling and minification. It would also require like additional dev tools locally, additional build tools on our server. Like that would be a much bigger lift for us than if we could try to target the Web Optimizer stuff. So that one actually looks fairly similar. We say add Web Optimizer and then add in the different configuration, and it kind of translates what it means for the files over here to the files over there. But we did find that the URLs aren't different. So our pages would have to know if they're using the bundled minified files from the new application or from the old application. So as we migrated controllers and actions and views, we would also change it to say, oh yeah, and also use this other new URL for the bundling and minified files. So in this case, legacy requests would still use the legacy bundling and minification pipeline built into MVC5. And all the .NET A requests would use the new pipeline for bundling and minification, which is Web Optimizer. But we wanted to make sure that we still shared the same static assets between both applications. That is, that JS CSS file exists in one place on disk, and I'm not copying and pasting JavaScript CSS files between applications. So the way we did this was there's a way you can like share files between projects through this thing called linking files, and a linked file has this little like, you can barely see it, but it looks kind of like a shortcut icon with a little arrow thing over there. So that's me instructing the IDE and the project system that this file, like, pretend it's here, but it's not. It's actually over there, and it's only going to exist one place on disk. But when I actually publish the application, then those files are actually duplicated in the final published result, which is OK, because these are two physically separate applications that are getting deployed. But developing locally, I want those files in one place. So I blogged about this too, so don't worry about copying this approach down. But the general idea is that you can use wildcards to say, all the files you find over here, pretend like they're over here through a link. So our typical migration, after getting this kind of initial setup going, was first we would copy the controller over, like copy paste, correct namespaces, and migrate any of the filters that were being used. So if you see like the attributes at the top of the controller, well, those have to get migrated to in some form or fashion. We'd also copy, if needed, any business logic and models. Now, we went with the shared library approach, so that everything was just already where we needed it to be. But we also needed to make sure that if my controllers were using additional packages that haven't been pulled in yet, I would pull those in as well. And we did this in a very incremental approach. I tried not to pull in all the packages all at once. As they brought a controller over and it needed new library X, that's when I would go ahead and pull that library over. Finally, so this is like MVC, model view controller. So we migrate the controller, migrate the M, whatever it is to do the M for the model, and finally copy over the views. So this is where things can become a little bit more complicated, as we saw the bundling and minification, right? Missing feature. But you may have a lot of custom code that supports your views. You may have HTML helper extensions. Anyone have any of those in their application? Yeah, probably have a lot of them. Because you want to have one way to render a button, and that one way is in an HTML helper extension. For the most part, those are just like type name changes and namespace changes. So I think before it was like an MVC HTML string, and now it's like an IMVC HTML string or something like that. So it's just these subtle type changes from ASP.NET 4.5 to ASP.NET Core. We kept a living wiki page, which was all these kind of cases for like, OK, when you hit this thing, then this is how you need to migrate it. So as we would encounter these scenarios, we made sure that we've got something we can go back to. And it's not someone's like memory that they'll forget. It's like we just keep a living document of these lessons we've learned and the migration steps. Now, this was something we actually, this last one is something that we actually stopped doing, which is we initially deleted the existing code. I would go back to the previous 4.5 application and delete the controller, delete the action, and delete the view, because we were having issues where if there was a bug in the .NET 8 application, or we messed something up, it would transparently proxy over to the existing application. We thought we were done, but we were wrong. It was just somehow messed up. Now, we've taken a different approach now, which is instead of us deleting the existing code, in all the lower environments, what we did was add a little header or indicator to the application code or the HTML that would just tell you where that code is being served from. Is this being served from the .NET 8 application, or is it being served from the .NET 4.5 application? And then it's very easy for us to go through, as we're clicking through the application, which one of these systems is actually running the code versus getting proxied over. So that's what we do today. Just add a little indicator that isn't turned on in production, but is in all the lower environments and locally. OK, so now we're going to get into like some of the annoying features that we had to deal with in ASP.NET. And the first one is session. Ugh. Session is shared state that lives, it can be in a web farm scenario. It could live in a single shared location, or you can have it in memory, but it's state that lives throughout multiple multiple requests of an individual user. So we had the case, of course, like if the user's clicking through the system and they introduce session variables on the ASP.NET 4.5 application, how does the .NET 8 application know that those session variables exist, and what are their values? There is no shared server for session. Like I can't depend on some third-party server. So the adapter part of the system web adapters also includes a way for us to, when an application needs session, the ASP.NET Framework application will now expose additional API endpoints to serve up session details, as well as if you need to write session, you can write those session details back as well. So in my ASP.NET Core application, when I need session data, it won't go into its own session store. It will instead call an API exposed on the ASP.NET application. And if I need to write, it will do a put instead of a get. So I'll go ahead and put that session data out. So the session data will always live in the ASP.NET Framework application until the very, very, very end. And then we'll transition over to the ASP.NET Core application. The way we have to do this, though, is because it's an API call now, like before you could put any random junk into session, right? If you did in-memory session, you could have any kind of binary object, anything, because it didn't even necessarily need to be serialized. But now, because I have API calls, we have to explicitly register that this needs to be, these are the different keys for session variables, and also we need to make sure they're serializable via JSON. So you may be doing some crazy stuff in your session that you probably shouldn't be doing, but that was one of the things we saw, like, oh my gosh, we were just stuffing our database entities in there. Like, we should never do that, but we were, so we had to fix those places as well, migrate them first in the ASP.NET application, and then expose them out through ASP.NET. So in this case, what this is doing is in the MVC5 application, it is now exposing the remote app server with an API key. So there is some security associated with it, like a shared secret for that API to call into session. And now my 4.5 application is also serving up this API endpoint to read and write session data. We have to now add a session client for the ASP.NET Core application. So I say, these are the explicit set of session keys that I support. And then I'm also adding here the remote app client to say, this is the, it's the same as the proxy2 address. And then here's the API key shared between those two different applications. Now, there are a few different options for working with session. You can technically do just every time you had session, bracket, whatever, the ASP.NET Core application would transparently know what to do. But we didn't want to do that because we wanted to make it very explicit that when you're doing this, you are calling an API over on ASP.NET, the ASP.NET 4.5. So we wound up saying, just make it the explicit version that I have to pull in a session client, and then that's where I make the call instead of using kind of a transparent adapter approach. We want to make things kind of screaming in your face that, hey, this is using this remote client and will need to be fixed whenever we migrate over to ASP.NET Core. Another kind of shared state we had was Hangfire. And if you're not familiar with Hangfire, it's a job scheduling and queuing extension for ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. It supports 4x and ASP.NET Core. Persistence of jobs is also cross-platform. So it can store job details inside of SQL or whatever. And it also supports multiple queues. But we wanted to make sure that we did not duplicate work. So if something initiated a job, that it didn't get picked up by both applications and execute the job twice. This is kind of that traditional competing consumers for queues problem. We want to make sure that for any job or message coming off the queue, that only one of the applications actually picks it up. So a typical usage of Hangfire looks something like this. We would have somewhere that would do some work and then in-queue a job, which is typically sending an email or sending out a notification, calling Twilio, whatever. That would be often some other, the actual background job. But the way that Hangfire works is that could just be another method in your controller action. So we're like, okay, how do we migrate that over when anything can kind of queue up these jobs? So the way we worked it was we would create two different queues, one for .NET 8 and the default one for MVC5. So an ASP.NET Core application, which is initiating and also consuming a job from .NET 8, we would have it go to the default core queue. But if the job is over on the .NET 4.8 side, we would switch over to the other queue. So we just had two separate queues, one for jobs that would run in .NET 8 and one for jobs that would run in .NET 4.8. All right, the last piece I want to talk about before we stop is authentication. And This is very much an it depends sort of thing. It's highly dependent on what your authentication scheme is. You can do if you're doing cookie authentication today, then that's also kind of a single sign-on sort of approach. So if you are doing that today, then you may be able to get away from that. Or what you can also do is something known as remote authentication, which is a similar idea to shared session, which is all the authentication is being done in the existing .NET Framework application, and then it will expose out API calls from the .NET 8 application to go get those authentication details from the .NET 4.8 application. Okay, there's definitely more things that we had to worry about at migration, so this could be like almost an entire workshop for all these different kind of things. But I wanted to kind of just kind of go through the last piece of the puzzle, which is the last sort of migration and turning off the lights. So this is like everything is gone. There are no more controllers being executing code inside of the ASP.NET 4.8 application. And so for this case, it would be like the final migration, which would be, one, we would enable session on ASP.NET Core and disable it on MVC5. So now ASP.NET Core is now doing session. We would remove all the remaining controllers and endpoints in MVC5. We would disable all of the remote client and proxying stuff. So no more YARP, no more remote clients for anything. And then remove any of the shims we had put in place to bridging over to MVC5. We would monitor any traffic, so push this out to production. And see if we're having any problems. And then finally, remove the MVC5 application from code, pipelines, and deployments. This is like the best feeling we had of massive deletion of code of the existing .NET 4.8 app. This is like an actual pull request from an application we were migrating where it had 500,000 lines of deleted code from the existing MVC5 application. So, some parting thoughts. Highly recommend doing incremental migrations because you're going to minimize risks by having those small, verifiable deployments all the way out to production. We, as much as possible, made sure that every controller, every time we migrated, we would test it and push it out all the way to production and not have these big bang batch-based approach. Except for web forms. Sorry, there is no incremental migration for this. This is a rewrite. So if you have one of those big web forms applications, you are going to be rewriting each one of those pages into something else. But that's just the way it is. System web adapters do definitely use that because that enables us incremental migration with YARP. But there'll always be something that's, I definitely didn't cover all the things that you're going to run into, but that's fine. There'll always be something unique to your system that will need to be migrated, but everything that I've seen is going to be overcomable because someone else has had to do this before you. Final thing is to avoid any kind of like improvements as you go, and this was tough for us because you're like, ooh, this one's using a lot of static junk. We should migrate this to dependency injection. But that just slowed down the train when we're looking at, looking down the barrel of 500 controllers. Any additional work on any one controller multiplies out to all of them. So we said, avoid any kind of like helpful fixes as we went. So thank you all very much. If you have any more questions about this, I'll be hanging around afterwards. Otherwise, this code and the presentation you can find on my GitHub down there, github.com/jbogardpresentations. Otherwise, thank you all for coming, and I had a great conference. So yeah.